Hello, I'm Julie Swenson, Managing Director of Forward Theater Company in Madison, Wisconsin.
And I'm Mike Fisher, Milwaukee-based theater writer and dramaturg.
I'm Jen Uphoff-Gray, founder and artistic director of Forward Theater Company. And this is Theater Forward, a twice-monthly conversation about theater from a local, regional, and national perspective. From Madison to Manhattan, we're excited to share insight into our own company while exploring issues surrounding theater in the Midwest and around the country. Welcome to episode 40 of Theater Forward.
40! All right!
So this week's conversation was inspired by the recent marking of the centennial of the 19th Amendment to the Constitution, giving women, well, some women, the right to vote. So that prompted us to ponder the work still needed within our industry to truly achieve gender parity. Where has progress been robust, and where do we still have much more to do? And Julie, I'd really love to start this conversation with you because you spent quite a few years building Renaissance Theater Works in Milwaukee. And tell us a little bit about Renaissance.
Yeah, I was there, a couple decades. So Renaissance Theater Works was founded in 1993. It is the second oldest theater company focusing on gender parity. And the idea was strong women's roles on stage and off. At the time, that was an unusual approach to theater, which I, find fascinating right now in 2020. I looked at the statistics in 1993. 17% of the country's playwrights were women. 11% of all the directors were women. And 6% of all professional theaters were run by women. I think that the stats have gotten a little bit better, but really not much. In 2015, it was 22% playwrights were women. So we've still got some work to do, but there are a lot of really great things happening. And more than anything, there's an awareness of when the 50-50 is not happening, where the gender parity is falling short. And I think Renaissance exposed that in Milwaukee and in the state. I think that even if companies are not working towards this parity, they're aware of where the deficiencies lie. I remember years ago, I had a young woman who was very angry at a theater company that had just unveiled their new season. And she said to me, "Oh my God, did you see there's hardly any women playwrights or directors?" And I said, "There isn't, that's true. And I am so happy you noticed that." And isn't that the big thing, that you have to notice first to make the change? And we certainly are noticing.
Yeah.
We're noticing, but being the greedy maximalist that you've all and love on this podcast, Julie, what you said is right. I mean, it's like that was 27 years ago, and we're still looking at really, really bad numbers. Where Renaissance in this state, and I include Forward in what I'm about to say, is the only equity house in the entire state that has achieved gender parity over its production history. And even with Renaissance, it was under gender parity until a couple of years ago, when it's been producing almost all women playwrights in the last few years. Now, I'm only talking about on stage, but it drives me a little nuts when, to my mind, by far in this country and in Britain, the best playwrights, cat interlude, the best across our screen, the best playwrights that we have writing right now are women, by and large. I mean, of course, these there's lots of good stuff coming from everywhere, and that we are still not at gender parity, or that we even have to talk about it in the ways that we do. Just it floors me, and it really makes me think that we're at a point where we need something akin to affirmative action or a quota system, where we need theater companies to step up and make a public commitment to producing at least 50% plays by women over, X span, so that, maybe in a particular season, there'd be wiggle room, but maybe over a 5-year period, there would be a commitment that at least 50% plays would be by women. I mean, Jeanette Rankin, when she was elected to Congress in 1916, got it exactly right. If we're half the population, we should be half the Congress. Well, damn it, if more than half the plays and way more than half the plays in terms of quality are being written by women, then that's what we should be seeing on American stages, and we're not.
There is such good work out there. And when you think about the number of women playwrights that have prominence now, a number of years ago when the Kilroys began, and for those who don't know, the Kilroys was a collective that was basically identifying plays by women out there that weren't getting adequately produced. And it was sort of similar to Rachel Shafkin's comments at the Tony Awards last year, like, there's a pipeline. Stop pretending there's not a pipeline. There's plenty of people out there that you can hire. And so the Kilroys started this list of women playwrights in response to, we would produce more plays by women if we knew what they were, right?
Don't exist.
Right. But the difference now is that there are so many really prominent women playwrights in America whose work is being done. When you look at the TCG's top 10 plays of the year and top 20 most produced playwrights of the year, those numbers are going way up. There's more women than men.
Right. In 2018, 8 of 11 of the most produced plays were by women.
Yeah.
So it happens.
Right. And there's these, incredible playwrights. And I'm just, just off the top of my head, you've got Heidi Schreck, you've got Amy Herzog, Katori Hall, Dominique Morisseau, Lauren Gunderson, Anne Washburn, Annie Baker. I mean, these are all phenomenally exciting playwrights. And no informed artistic director could say they weren't aware of the work by these women anymore. And you're very right to point out, Mike, that even at Forward, where, I think we clearly take gender equity very seriously, we haven't hit, over our 11-year history to date, we're at, I think, 41% of the main stage plays
which
have
is
been
way
written
better
by women.
than almost everybody else.
I mean, it's almost double the national average, but it's still not at parity. And that's a problem. That's a problem.
And of course, when you look at plays by women of color, it's dramatically worse. I mean, 2 years ago, 6% of the plays in This Women were produced by women of color, and it's Dominique, it's Lynn Nottage, it's Jocelyn Bio, it's Aziza Barnes, it's Jackie Sibley's Story. I mean, you go on, and yet the plays are not getting are not getting done. And I think that intersectionality between gender and race, which you alluded to, Jen, in your very first comment, in terms of how the 19th Amendment and the movement itself shafted women of color, is really important in terms of keeping in mind that that's an additional challenge that we're not meeting in an adequate way.
Yeah, and I realized I said Rachel Shefkin and meant Rebecca Teichman, so that's embarrassing. No, I meant Rachel Shafkin. It was Rebecca Teichman who won for. Anyway, now I'm getting all tangled up in my, brilliant women directors. Oh my God, we all look alike. That's. But that actually that segues to me into, maybe a corollary issue that is maybe more near and dear even to my heart, which is women directors, because coming up in the theater, spending most of the 90s and the first half of the 2000s in New York, working in the commercial Broadway and off-Broadway theater, there just weren't women getting hired as directors. There just weren't. You could count them on a hand. What was it? The first Tony Award for a woman director wasn't until 1998, and it was 2 won that year, Julie Taymor and Gary Hines, for musical and play. But that wasn't, I counted it up last night. There've been over 130 Tony Awards given for Best Director, and 9 of them have gone to women.
Yeah. Well, yeah. And you look at, and this comes out of that really, I thought, terrific playbill, Women's Centennial celebration which went through the last 100 years celebrating women in theater. I have to be honest, and I consider myself fairly well-versed in theater history. I was embarrassed by how many people all the way through. I can't even just sort of hide behind saying I didn't know some playwright in the 20s. How many people I didn't know, how many shows I didn't know, how much of this great work that's being done by women is stuff that I don't know. And I follow this stuff. So, what does that say about, maybe it's because I'm a guy, maybe. I think it's because this stuff isn't being out there. But some of the statistics in that, Jen, in terms of the Tony thing, no Black woman has yet won for Best Play, Best Book, Best Score, Best Director. No woman of Asian descent has yet won for Best Director. No Latinx woman has yet won for Best Play, Best Book, or Best Score. Yeah. So, which is just, again, it compounds the issue that you're pointing to. 37% of off-Broadway directors and designers are women. Now, that's actually better than most of the country, but that's a third.
Yeah. Well, and if we pivot back away from Broadway and think about regional theaters, I mean, Julie, I think you and I, it'd be interesting to talk about our perspective on this, because on the one hand, the percentages of women leading regional institutions, whether as artistic directors, managing directors, it's much better than it was, when in the statistics you were citing from when Renaissance began, but still really low. On the other hand, here you and I we run our company. And it struck me.
Wisconsin is doing okay.
That's exactly what I was going to say. When I did move back here after my time in New York and was sort of looking at the professional theater community around me, I was like, well, there's a fair number of women leading these organizations. And those numbers have gotten much better in recent years, not just with Forward, but with American Players Theater and the ascension of Brenda DeVita as their artistic director. Here in Madison, Children's Theater of Madison, their artistic director, Roseanne Sheridan. The Madison Opera here is led by Catherine Smith. I mean, it's really in this sort of pocket, we've got a lot of women leadership. And it's sometimes easy for me, even as a woman, to forget how big a problem it still is nationwide, because I feel like we're in this little, I'm not going to call it a utopia, because there's still a lot of lack of parity.
Work to be done.
A lot of work to be done, but there are a large number of women in leadership positions, and that's great. But I'm wondering, Julie, have you experienced the trajectory of your career as one in which you encountered a lot of barriers, or was that not as much the case for you?
I know that when Renaissance was just starting out, there was this idea, by saying we're a woman's company focusing on gender parity, there was some inference that this had become political, that we were angry women. We had to, in those first 10 years, I felt that I was continuously saying ridiculous things like, but we still hire men. We still like men. I mean, really, truly had to, it makes me sound like I'm 110, but this wasn't that long ago that we were apologizing for that. We were apologizing for saying we're 50% of the population and we should be 50% of the people who get employed in theater. So that was an uphill battle for a long time. And it is not so much of an uphill battle. I mean, I don't know that, certainly when I was hired as managing director at Forward, I don't think there was even a ripple that now there's two women that are, leading this theater company. I don't think that registered. And that's pretty great. Can I tell you a story? It's one of my very favorite stories that we used to, I think still do, talk about at Forward, at Renaissance. It has nothing to do with Renaissance, but it's a really great.
Please.
So in 1952, the Boston Symphony was predominantly men. And the idea was that there's just men are better musicians. And the Boston Symphony said, is that really true? I'm not sure about that. And they had blind auditions, and they put the musicians behind a screen. And for the first year, it was majority men went to the next level. And then the following year, they made everyone take off their shoes. And you couldn't hear the high heels behind the screen. And it became 50-50. And you look at orchestras now, and they're pretty, the gender parity is there. And I don't know how we would do that in a similar vein with playwrights. Or, do you have a director behind a screen just giving, here's how I'd like to do this show without a voice? Or, how do we do blind casting for that kind of thing?
Right. Casting's
almost impossible.
I love that story. I mean, casting's hard, but it does make me think of a statistic I was pulling recently. At Forward, we have our main stage shows. And as I said before, in our 11 years, the 41% of our writers have been women. But when I look at, we do a new work festival every single season, 2 different festivals of different kinds of work, but they alternate, but 11 seasons of new work. And I looked at that, and we do read those submissions and evaluate them blind. At the end of the process, we look at who wrote those. But for both of those, we have open submissions, and they're evaluated blind. And 51% of our writers of all the new work we've produced have been women. So maybe that's the equivalent.
That's our equivalent of the screen.
Of that story. And it's harder to do. I will say, and you're right, there was no, having been on the other side of the process, when you got hired as managing director, there was no pushback on, if we've got Jen, maybe we should hire a man to be managing director. There was none of that. But there's certainly been times, Forward's 11 years old. For our first 9 seasons, we did 3 shows a year on our main stage, and I would direct 2 of them for cost reasons as much as anything else, and we would hire 1 guest director. Now it's half and half. I do 2, and we have 2 guests. But for the first several years, we were hiring women to direct as the guest directors. And there was some pushback from various places of, you need to hire some men directors. And I did recall thinking, do I really? Is it really a problem that these men are not getting hired at this particular theater right now, when everywhere else around me?
Life is tough on white men. I don't know what to tell you, Jen.
I know.
Sorry, I'm not getting that across to you.
That's all right. Well, and we have obviously hired quite a few men to direct at Forward over these 11 years, but I was looking, and again, I skewed the numbers because I'm directing half or more of what we do, but our directors for the main stage, something like 88%, and that is certainly not reflective regionally. But what is exciting, I do think we're seeing a really fabulous new wave of artistic directors at major regional theater companies who are women and women of color.
Right.
And it's thrilling to watch someone like Hannah Sharif at St. Louis Rep, Maria Goyanis at Woolly Mammoth, Nataki Garrett at Oregon Shakespeare Festival. I mean, to see what those women in those leadership positions may achieve in the coming years is really exciting. And of course, we know that the deck can be stacked against women when they take over a major organization, and especially for women of color. But I'm hopeful that in this moment, when our entire field is re-examining our biases and our lack of equity, that will lead to increased support rather than decreased for the leadership of these women. So I'm optimistic. I'm not feeling, pessimistic about what the future holds. I'm excited and hoping that we see faster movement towards parity in the coming years.
Well, I think it will come. I mean, because it has been stuck. It's gone a little bit for, honest to God, 100 years. We're talking about the women's, a right to vote. The statistics of women playwrights hasn't changed that much in 100 years. But I do think that women in charge of companies, I do think more directors. the playwrights is the critical element here. Women playwrights write more women's roles. But, the stories they tell are different. And that's the key right there are the playwrights. And it changes the dynamic of everything then on stage.
And I'd love to see more and more women in the pipeline for other positions in theaters. Well, I mean, there's for many years, women have dominated costume design, women have dominated stage management hires, although not at the top levels. Like if you look at Broadway, costume designers, Broadway production stage managers, there's still not parity there. But through the regions and around the country in those two areas. But, I want to see more and more women lighting designers. I mean, we have some extraordinary ones that we've worked with here at Forward. Scenic designers, we need more women scenic designers, composers and sound designers. We've got some, but not as many as I would like to see. And a pipeline of artistic leadership talent. One of the great developments that I've observed in the field in the last few years is the founding of the Statera organization, which is focused on women, people who identify as female in the theater, providing, with a key focus being providing mentorships and structured mentorships. They recently started a Milwaukee chapter, so I've been able to mentor someone this year. Other members of our company have had mentees. I'm really looking forward to continuing that. That mentorship is so important because we need an equivalent to the old boys club that exists in every field everywhere, right? And so how do we create that pathway for young women coming up in the field? Because especially in the theater, especially for things like, for acting, you audition. And even if there's a lack of parity or good roles, I mean, we see a lot of parity on stages now, I think. But for so many, and you can walk into an audition as a young person and get cast if your scene is right for the role. All these other positions are so based on who you hire as a designer. You don't come in and audition really, right?
Right.
Who you hire as a director, who you hire as a stage manager. Relationships inevitably play such an enormous role in how that work gets allocated. And so creating those mentorship relationships and that pathway and that access is so crucial for all of those aspects of our field.
I'm glad you brought up the always forgotten stepchild in theater, which is design. It's a study came out last year that was published in Theater Design and Technology. 29% of design positions are being filled by women, and they asked, which to me is even more interesting than the distressing statistic. They asked women designers, what were the major barriers? By far, with nobody else even close, sound and lighting design had the highest incidence of sexual harassment. We haven't even talked about that. You'd like to think that we're in a point where that kind of stuff, in addition to the mansplaining and the low-level microaggressions, that we're past that, but we're not. Over 90% of women designers in those two fields have experienced sexual harassment of some kind. That was the first thing they mentioned. And the second thing, which applies to this entire discussion and women in every level of theater, is childcare. We live in a country which is one of the only countries in the entire world that provides no public subsidy in any way for family leave and provides no help in any way for childcare. In a world where, unfortunately, women are still more often than not saddled with the predominant share of child-rearing responsibilities. So until we deal with those issues, and help change the larger context, which, by the way, we've all got the right to vote now. We're celebrating for the 100th year. We're not going to be able to make the significant changes in those areas that I think we need to. That will be a big part of it.
Yeah. Go ahead, Mike.
No.
I was going to say that makes me think about the first national tour that I got to direct. I was 31 years old. And I was basically remounting Michael Blakemore's Broadway production of Copenhagen by Michael Frayn. I had been the associate director for the Broadway production, and they hired me to basically remount it with the touring cast. And my first day of rehearsal, my firstborn child was 5 weeks old.
Oh,
and I basically hired a nanny who would spend the day in the green room where we were rehearsing with my son. And I was never so grateful for the equity break every 80 minutes where I would run to the green room and nurse my baby. And then I would, after 10 minutes, run back into the rehearsal room, and we would do that all day. And then I would strap him into the baby Bjorn and get on the subway and go back home. And I'm ever so grateful that those producers just totally worked with that. I'm also grateful that my son didn't decide to come later than he did, so that he would have been even younger. And he and my husband came with me when we, did the out of town tech in Laguna Beach, California. And, that I have such incredibly fond memories of all that. But then I also think, okay, well, then what came next? Which was what he hit maybe 6 months old, and you couldn't just strap him on in a baby Bjorn and bring him along. Now he actually needed a different kind of care and support, and it became much harder to find work that I could do while also taking care of my son and being his mom. And it was only a few years after that I decided that working in New York just wasn't fitting with my life, and moved back here. But I do, my gosh, I love those memories of being in that rehearsal room and work, and especially play like Copenhagen, this meaty intellectual thing with my, postpartum brain, and then let's go, feed the baby.
No, I love that. And that's, there are so many stories like that. And we've all, I'm assuming, been in rooms where we've seen those kinds of things happening. And God bless the companies allowing it. And my hat's off to the amazing women who are doing that. But I shouldn't have to say amazing women, right? I mean, this is just a woman being a person in a way where she's being put in a tough position, even if she's got some support around her, because we're not being more sensitive as a society to these kinds of things. I mean, I was listening to this interview the other day with Simon Stevens and Alice Birch. Alice Birch is just an extraordinarily great playwright, one of the most exciting playwrights to my mind in Britain right now. And she's talking about what it's like having an 8-month-old and a 5-year-old, and just how hard it is to find time to write. And the part about what she said that was the hardest for me and just so moving, and she said, I'm an all or nothing kind of person. I want to be a fantastic mother, and I want to be a fantastic artist. And what she didn't say, because she wasn't throwing herself a pity party, but my God, why do we have to live in a world where you have to choose? Especially when what you learn as a woman in those situations can feed, as we see in so many great plays. I mean, we did one last year with Mary Jane, by Amy Herzog, can feed extraordinary work and teach us something about care and empathy. It breaks my heart.
Yeah. Anyone who's looking for some really inspiring stuff to read about the juggle of parenthood and playwriting, Sarah Rule, her book of essays, I think it's called 100 Essays. Oh God.
I didn't have time to write or something like that?
Yes. Yeah. So many of those deal with parenthood and being a playwright. It's such a good read. I remember scanning so many of those, just to have them close at hand. Yeah.
And the gift that she can then give us, that's a perfect example. Another forward play, the In the Next Room, or the Vibrator play. I mean, I can think of few plays that moved me so much in terms of what they said about what it's like to be a mother and a woman in a society that doesn't really fully, despite its best intentions, best in quotes, understand what those two things are like. And we need plays like that to help us all become more aware of what is blah, 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 blah.
I've seen so much discussion in the field, especially over the last 5 years or so, about a movement for support for caregivers in our field, as well as this movement towards gender parity. And, as we've talked about before, we're in a moment right this minute where our field is very, very focused on the critical work of anti-racism and that aspect of diversity and how critical that work is to our entire field and to all the fields around us. But we are also working on our gender parity. We are also working on support for caregivers, and those don't need to cancel each other out. More freedom means more freedom. More equality means more equality. And all of these efforts can happen together. They can happen at the same time. And as we know, when we think about anti-racism, when we think about the demands of We See White American Theater, when we think about that movement, many of the issues that are raised have to do with gender discrimination against women of color. Many of the issues have to do with the difficulties of being the sole child care provider and having a career. And so keeping our focus, we can be explicitly working on anti-racism and also broadly working on how we make our field more inclusive, more equitable for everybody at the same time. All of us theater workers are creative people with large and comprehensive brains, and we can contain multitudes, and we need to.
So well said, Jen.
That's exactly really
right. Mm-hmm.
Well, then maybe we should stop right there.
Yeah, I got nothing on that,
man. We will say that is it for this episode of Theater Forward, a conversation about theater in Wisconsin, the Midwest, and America. Thank you for joining us. I'm Jen Uphoff-Gray.
I'm Julie Swenson.
And I'm Mike Fisher. Our podcast is produced by Scott Hayden, and you can follow us or share your thoughts on Facebook, Twitter, and Instagram at Theater Forward, as always, with an ER.
And if you enjoy this podcast, don't forget to subscribe to us on Apple Podcasts or wherever you might tune in. And be sure to leave a stellar review.
We're so grateful to have you listening, and we will be back soon for another Theater Forward conversation.